Hi and welcome to Chock's Hangar. Chock's Hangar? Well, what's all that about, eh? Well, I've had a YouTube channel for a number of years, and those of you that are subscribed to my channel, or if you've chanced across one of my videos, if you are subscribed, by the way, thank you for being subscribed, will know that the content that I produce is, it can be a bit varied. It's very often aviation related, but sometimes it's other stuff. But what I realised is that I actually really like making aviation related content. Real world aviation and flight simulation, which is another thing that I'm really interested in. I've been a reviewer of flight simulator products for a number of years, and I've worked in the aviation industry for years, still do. And I've had a pilot's license for 22 years now, so I'm fairly clued up about aviation. I like making YouTube content related to that, so what I decided to do with my YouTube channel was kind of increase the frequency of the videos that I produce and try and up the quality a little bit to make it a more entertaining watch for you, and sort of tighten the focus a little bit so that it is more aviation related. And as I say, real world and flight simulator and news and updates. You probably saw that from the intro, the kind of stuff that I'm hoping to cover. But what I'm also hoping to cover with it is stuff that you want to see. So what I would like you to do is to help by letting me know the kind of stuff that you want to see. So you can do that by placing your comments down below on this and any other videos that I produce, and let me know the kind of stuff that you'd like to see. I don't know, maybe you've got a question about real world aviation, or maybe there's a tutorial that you like. Or maybe there's a flight simulator product or something related to that, or maybe a real-world aviation product that you'd like me to take a look at and review and what have you. Entirely up to you. But if there is something like that, then let me know in the comments down below, and I will try and make a video about it for you. Now, so why Chock's Hangar? Well, those of you that know me from various aviation-related forums that you find on the internet, things like avsim.com, who I was a staff reviewer for a long time. If you know me from places like that, you'll know that I usually tend to go by the forum name of Chock. And so I thought, well, in giving my YouTube channel a bit of aviation-related focus, why not call it Chock's Hangar? So that's why it's called Chock's Hangar. But if you prefer to call me Al, then feel free to do so. I don't mind. You can call me Al, or call me Chock if you prefer. I really don't mind. But as I say, if you're already subscribed to my channel, then thanks for being subscribed, and get those comments down below. And if you're not subscribed, you might want to consider doing so if aviation-related stuff is the kind of thing that you like for Chock's Hangar. Now, it will not have escaped your attention that I'm wearing a pair of goggles, and don't worry, I don't go around dressed like this all the time, although some people that know me might beg to differ on that. But the reason I'm actually wearing these goggles is there's actually two reasons. One is to provide a bit of a hint as to what we're going to be looking at for this first video, but also what we're actually going to be looking at, the aircraft that we're going to be looking at, is one that I'm actually going to be flying for real later this year. And because that's so, I thought, well, I better go and find my flying cap and dust that off, and give my goggles a bit of a clean, give the lenses a bit of a wipe. So I did that earlier on, and I thought, well, let's stick them on my head for a bit of a prop to give you a bit of a clue as to what we're going to look at. So I'm going to be flying one of these for real later on this year. Still got a little bit of working out to do in relation to that, but I'm certainly going to make sure that happens. And hopefully, what I'll be able to do is make that flight the content of a video for Chock's Hangar, because I think that'd be kind of interesting to see. But for now, what we're going to do is, because aviation can be quite expensive, you don't have to spend a fortune to experience that kind of thing, because what we're going to do is going to learn a little bit about the real aeroplane, and look at some of the flight simulator versions of this aeroplane that you can enjoy, and have a good old nosy at this thing, because it is an absolute classic of aviation. So there you go. And obviously Chock's Hangar, being a new venture, has got to start somewhere, so why not start with a total classic? So thank you for joining me on the venture that is going to be Chock's Hangar. I really appreciate you watching this. Feel free to get involved. Now, If you're at all au fait with the history of aviation and maybe you like your classic airplanes, if you go to museums or air shows and all that kind of stuff, then you probably recognize the sound in the distance of the engine, that sort of buzzsaw sound. It'll tell you that it's something with a radial engine because of the high RPM, the sound of the prop blades going supersonic. So you can hear that. You know that it's got an open cockpit because they've got exclusive. You might be able to guess what it is, but if not, let's check it out as it flies past. Here we go. Went past very fast, didn't it? Pretty low too. Do you see what it was? Well, even if you couldn't make it out, you certainly saw that flash of yellow and blue, and you'll probably recognize that they are the colors that the US Army Air Force and the US Navy used during World War II for their training airplanes. It was, of course, a Stearman. Boeing Stearman, as it later became, Model 75 in its civilian guise. It got a few other names. It had Navy designations and Army designations related to what engines it had. But we're going to have a look at all that in the video that's coming up and learn a little bit about it, and then we're going to check out the flight simulator versions of it. So that's all going to be very cool, and I hope you're going to enjoy it. So thank you for joining me, and I'll shut up now, and let's go and check out the Stearman, shall we? Are you ready? Come on, let's go.
Stearman Model 75, designed in 1934 and with over 10,000 built, it's one of several primary trainer biplane types responsible for showing literally thousands of young men the joys of flying. And it remains a popular choice for pilots even today, with many Stearmans still airworthy. But to understand why this is so, we need to go back to a time before the Stearman even left the drawing board, let alone the ground. A time when the first chapters of aviation were still waiting to be written. The Great War of 1914 to 1918 began with aeroplanes scarcely more sophisticated than the Wright brothers' 1903 Flyer, which had made the first manned heavier-than-air powered sustained flight when it lifted off and flew the length of a football field. And just 5 years before the Great War commenced, Louis Blériot had soared into the history books too, by crossing the English Channel in an aircraft of his own design, a distance of 21 miles between Calais and Dover, a feat which many considered impossible at the time. This same aircraft type initially served with many armies at the start of the Great War, yet just 4 years later, at the end of that war, there were aircraft which could lift over 2,000 pounds of bombs and carry them for distances of hundreds of miles. The Great War had shown us that the dreams of aviation could have a darker side. Yet in 1919, the year after the war ended, one of these same bomber aircraft, in civilian guise, showed us that the dreams of aviation had not died in that war, when it lifted off to cross the Atlantic and link the old world with the new. Aeroplanes had shown us that they could be something more than simply a way for us to kill our fellow man. When the Great War ended, thousands of men and women were demobilized from service. They returned to civilian life armed with the skills necessary to design, build, maintain, and operate aeroplanes. The inventories of the armies were full of equipment now surplus to requirements, and among these was the Curtiss JN-4. Affectionately known as the Jenny, perhaps more so than any other airplane in history, this former military trainer was responsible for the expansion of civil aviation in the United States of America. Originally costing $5,500 apiece when built for the Army, and with almost 7,000 produced, these were now auctioned off to the public at bargain basement prices, sometimes for as little as $50. To put that in context, in 1920, $50 would have bought you a top-of-the-range typewriter, and in today's money it equates to about $750. Among the people who bought themselves a Jenny at that time was a certain Charles Lindbergh in order to teach himself how to fly. Lindbergh paid $500 for his Jenny with the help of a loan from relatives, his Jenny being brand new, still in its crate, and with numerous spares included. Jennies barnstormed, flew joyrides, and most importantly, they flew mail across the United States for the Postal Service. It was even immortalized on a stamp, the first 100 of which were printed with the Jenny erroneously inverted. The famous inverted Jenny stamp is now one of the most sought after in the world. But printing errors aside, this is really where the story of the Stearman Model 75 begins. It was an optimistic time, and in 1925 3 men got together to form a new aircraft company. They were Lloyd Stearman, Walter Beech, and Clyde Cessna. All 3 men were already experienced aeroplane engineers and designers by this time, and together they formed the Travel Air Manufacturing Company. Lloyd Stearman had studied engineering, and in 1918 he learned to fly in the United States Naval Reserve. Following this, he was hired as a mechanic with Laird Swallow, the makers of several early trainer aeroplane types. Walter Beech was a US Army pilot in the Great War, after which he too joined Laird Swallow as a test pilot, where he met Stearman. Clyde Cessna had worked on agricultural machinery and motor cars, but in 1911 he built an aeroplane of his own, based on the Blériot machine. 13 proved a lucky number for Cessna, when after 12 previous attempts at flight, which had ended in mishaps, his machine finally flew. Encouraged by this, Cessna started his own aviation school and aircraft manufacturing facility, but World War I put a halt to this endeavour. However, in 1925, he joined the other 2 men to form Travel Air Manufacturing. As important and influential as the Jenny was, she dated from 1916 and only had a top speed of around 75 miles an hour. And whilst this made her a great trainer in World War I, and in fact up until 1927 with the Army, by the mid-1920s she was showing her age. The US Postal Service was keen to find a faster, more modern replacement aeroplane to deliver its mail. The vast numbers of Jennies which flooded the US market had hindered sales of a new aeroplane type for several years, but by 1925 the need for a better aeroplane was a pressing one in the United States. The combined practical experience of the 3 men led to Travel Air becoming the most successful US airplane manufacturer of the mid to late 1920s, with well over 1,000 airplanes having been built. Among them this Travel Air 2000, which you see here, and this, the Travel Air 4000, which they also produced. Travel Air biplanes and monoplanes of the era combined the very best attributes of the day, including balanced ailerons and welded tubular steel fuselages. These were features which had been pioneered by Dutchman Anthony Fokker during World War I, and this led Travel Air's designs to often be referred to as Wichita Fokkers. The resemblance to some of the Dutchman's designs for the Germans during World War I was certainly not lost on filmmakers of the day, with many of the Travel Air types playing the role of German warplanes in epic war films of the era, such as The Dawn Patrol and Hell's Angels, made by the likes of Howard Hughes and Howard Hawks. This served to cement the reputation for rugged reliability and fighter-like performance for Travel Air products. Yet as successful as Travel Air was, the 3 men who founded the company didn't always agree on the direction the company should take. Arguments over whether to concentrate on trusted biplane designs or more pioneering monoplane types, and even all-metal stress skin designs, eventually led to a parting of ways between the 3 men, with each man going on to forge his own legend, under the names of Cessna, Beechcraft, and of course Stearman. We could be forgiven for thinking that Stearman was the least adventurous of the 3, in choosing to have his new Stearman company concentrate on making a biplane type suited to carry out mail flights and be a candidate for the next training aeroplane for the US Army and Navy. But if we thought this, then we should certainly be doing Lloyd Stearman a great disservice. By the mid-1930s, most people were aware that despite their best wishes, World War I would not prove to be the war to end all wars. As such, the US military was once again in the market for a suitable primary trainer. They had evaluated several types, including numerous travel air products, but all were found lacking in some form or another. What they needed was a new design. The Stearman Company's first products took the very best features of the travel air types and refined them still further, resulting in some of the most advanced and fastest mail planes and sporting biplanes ever built, including this, the Stearman Model 4 Speedmail. But it would require a little more effort to make it a suitable primary trainer for the military. In 1934, Stearman began work on what would eventually become the Model 75. Coincidentally, that same year, the US Navy, always keen to differentiate itself from the Army, began designing their own primary trainer too. On the face of it, designing a good training aeroplane might seem like a fairly simple task. That is until you look a little closer at the actual requirements. It's then you realize nothing could be further from the truth. A trainer needs to be relatively simple to operate and control, yet not so simple as to be ineffective in managing to impart the skills which will later be required in order to be able to operate much heavier and much more powerful military aeroplanes. It has to be reliable, it has to be able to withstand clumsy handling, and also easy to maintain. And if it can also serve as a good tool with which to train mechanics, riggers, and other personnel, then so much the better. With such exacting requirements, we can certainly appreciate how significant the old Jenny was, and we can also see why the aeroplane the Navy produced looked like this. If you thought this was a Stearman, you certainly wouldn't be the first, nor will you be the last to make that mistake. But this is in fact a Naval Aircraft Factory N3N. On first acquaintance, she looks virtually identical to the Model 75, but there are in fact many differences between the two aeroplanes. Apart from the fact that she has a different engine, she's also a bit larger and quite a bit heavier. The fin is a little different in profile, and she has 2 bracing struts on her tail as opposed to the Stearman's 4 bracing wires. She has larger wheels, and unlike the Stearman, she has 4 ailerons, although these days many surviving Stearmans have been modified so that they too have ailerons on both the upper and the lower wings. Perhaps the main differences, however, are under the skin. The Model 75 is built with a welded tubular steel fuselage and wooden wings. The N3N has a riveted extruded aluminium fuselage and aluminium wings too. The slightly larger size of the N3N and its all-metal construction, plus the fact that it was designed from the outset to also be built as a float plane, resulted in the N3N being a couple of £100 heavier. The two aeroplanes use different aerofoils too. The upshot of all this is that the Stearman is a little bit faster and a little bit more manoeuvrable than the N3N. Ultimately, the Navy eventually produced almost 1,000 N3Ns, but eventually they too bought the Stearman to use as their primary trainer. For the cinephiles among you, the N3N is noteworthy for having been the star of an iconic movie sequence. The 1959 Alfred Hitchcock movie, North by Northwest, starring Cary Grant and James Mason, is perhaps most remembered for the scene where Grant is lured into a meeting at an isolated bus stop and then is attacked by a crop duster aeroplane. Most people think that aeroplane was a Stearman, but it was in fact an N3N. However, at the climax of the scene where the aeroplane collides with a fuel tanker and explodes, that is very briefly indeed a Model 75 Stearman. At this point in the tale, It's worth noting that the Stearman still might have just been a footnote in aviation history, even being as good as it was, were it not for a stroke of good fortune. The Stearman company was absorbed into the Boeing company at about the same time that they were designing and producing the Model 75. And with the military contacts and leverage which Boeing enjoyed at that time, Boeing were able to actively promote the Model 75, or Cadet as it was now named, with those in charge of evaluating and procuring military aircraft. Of course, it helped that the Model 75 was a great aeroplane, but it certainly also helped that Boeing were able to let the Model 75 be evaluated in that training role.
So there you go, the Boeing Stearman. What a great design. And of course, by the time these guys, the Imperial Japanese Army, got it in their heads to attack the United States in late 1941, there were already very many British and Commonwealth pilots who'd come to appreciate what a great design Lloyd Stearman had come up with in the Model 75. And of course, when the United States got into World War II, very many American pilots would have learned to appreciate the same thing. And you can appreciate it too, thanks to the joys of flight simulation. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a look at some of the flight simulator versions that you can get, because there are quite a few of them. You ready? Let's go.
It's almost an embarrassment of riches for those who want a flight sim version of a Stearman, and they range from completely free to relatively expensive payware. And in this case, it's not always true that you get what you pay for either. But to be fair, what I'm going to do is use 6 criteria to mark the choices, and from that, hopefully we can determine a winner. However, you should keep in mind that everyone will, to some extent, regard these criteria in their own preferred order of importance. So, the criteria I'm going to use are as follows: how it looks, how it sounds, how it handles on the ground, how it flies, system simulation, plus any other special features. Okay, so the first flight simulator Stearman that we're going to take a look at is this one. This one is completely free, as is the simulator it runs in, because this is the default Stearman included with Microsoft Flight. So, you know, if you've not got Microsoft Flight, do a search on Google, find out where you can download it, and it's completely free. It's not even a very large download, and this thing is included with it. There are several paint schemes that come with it, although Microsoft Flight has some gaming elements to it, so not all of the paint schemes are available to you initially in the flight simulator, because you have to perform some tasks in order to unlock them. But this is one of the paint schemes that's available right from the start, and you can see that what it is depicting is a United States Navy trainer from the World War II era. The United States Navy referred to this as the N2N, and it's depicting an original airframe, no tweaks to it, no additional ailerons on the upper wing or anything like that. However, it's modelled as though it's a post-war modification, so it's not got the original engine that an N2N probably would have had during that period. What you can see is that this thing has a Pratt & Whitney R985 Wasp Junior engine. Pratt & Whitney made nearly 40,000 Wasp Junior engines. Some of them were 300 horsepower, the vast majority of them were 450 horsepower. Originally, Stearman's had 220 horsepower engines, so this was quite a popular modification made to Stearmans that were purchased after World War II, because obviously it made it a little bit faster, and because it was going a little bit faster, there'd be more airflow over the wings, so it'd be a little bit more manoeuvrable as well. So there are a lot of Stearmans about with Wasp Junior engines on them, and that's why this thing is depicted like that. One of the major changes that does appear when a Wasp Junior engine is fitted to a Stearman, however, is that it would probably have an electric start mechanism on it, as opposed to the hand-cranked inertia starter that most Stearmans would have had in World War II. It will also have an additional electrical system added to it that not every Stearman had. when they were used as trainers. Some of them had a basic electrical system, the ones that we used for IFR training. Some of them had hardly any electrical system at all. This one is depicted with a modern electrical system. So you can see that it's a very nice model, very high polygon, and it's really beautifully textured as well. And the texture stands up to close inspection. You can see that if I zoom in on that stenciling, it looks really good. And if I zoom in on that R985 engine, you can see that that is beautifully modelled and textured as well. You can even see that they've made it look like it's got braided hoses on the thing. So it looks really great, and it looks really great on the outside and the inside too. So if we take a look on the inside of it, you can see here we are in the virtual cockpit, and the modelling is really detailed, beautifully textured too. So let's have a look at what you get in this thing. Now, when you're inspecting an aeroplane, in the cockpit, what you normally do is you start on the left hand side and work your way across to the right hand side. So let's do that and take a look at this thing. So I'll zoom in a little bit. So the first thing on the left hand side is this, the trim lever, where you can trim the elevator so that you can fly the thing hands off and it will stay in level flight. Now you'll notice that when I move that, it's also moving the cable that runs back to the trim tab on the elevator at the rear of the plane. So really nice animation, really nice detailing. I'm going to leave the trim in the neutral position. It's in the neutral position when the lever is pointing straight up. Forward of that, here is the throttle quadrant. Try saying that when you've had a few. This is not as the throttle quadrant would have originally been on most Stearmans in the 1930s and 1940s, in that it has 3 controls, but you get a lot of variation on the throttle quadrants in Stearmans. Originally, most Stearmans would probably only have had a throttle control. When it's fully forward, that's full throttle. When it's fully back, that is the throttle on 0. You can see that this is sort of twitching a little bit on here. That's not a problem with the aeroplane in the simulator. That's a bit of dirt on my joystick throttle, so I probably ought to clean that. Give it a bit of shove backwards and forwards and see if that smooths out a little bit. So originally Stearmans would have had a throttle control there. They would also have had a mixture control. Fully forward is fully rich on the mixture, fully back is fully lean to the cutoff position. So I'm going to push that all the way forward to fully rich. Some throttle quadrants on Stearmans had a button on the side of the throttle which when you pressed it would activate an intercom system, but not every Stearman had an intercom system. A lot of them simply had a speaking tube that you could shout down to talk to someone in the other cockpit. Most Stearmans in the World War II era and the 1930s would not have had this control on them. This is a propeller RPM control, and it's got that on this one because it is depicting a Stearman post-war with a replacement engine, that being, as we know, an R985 Wasp Junior. So you wouldn't normally see that propeller RPM control on most Stearmans. What you would normally see on most Stearmans, however, but not on this one, is in about this position there would be a fuel cutoff switch. It's a simple on-off switch. It opens a valve to the fuel tank on the Stearman, and the fuel tank on a Stearman is located on the upper wing there, and when you open the valve, the fuel can come down that pipe that you can see there, and then it can get to the carburetor and run the engine. There is you can see the little glass fuel gauge on there as well. So most Stearmans do actually have a little cut-off switch which is located there. It's not that big a deal that they haven't included it on this. The next thing that you can see is the magneto switch. It's got an off position, a left magneto, a right magneto, and a both position. Normally you'd run it with both magnetos providing a spark to the engine, and it's one of the things that you would test when you start the thing up. To the right of that on the instrument panel you can see a manifold pressure gauge. This thing has a manifold pressure gauge because it's depicted with a more modern engine, and the manifold pressure is related to the propeller speed control. So you wouldn't have seen a manifold pressure gauge on most Stearmans in World War II and the late 1930s. To the right of that, slightly below it, there is an altimeter, or altimeter if you prefer to pronounce it like that, and it has a little knob that you can turn on it to change the settings so that it will read 0 when you're on the ground. To the right of that, there is a magnetic compass. Above that, there is an airspeed indicator calibrated in miles per hour, and rather optimistically marked for 300 miles an hour. No Stearman's really going to do 300 miles an hour, but a lot of aeroplanes have standard instruments put in them, and then they have a marking added to them to suit them to the specific aeroplane, and you can see that that's happened on this thing. It has a red line marked at 185 miles per hour. You'd be doing well to get 185 miles an hour out of a Stearman. You'd probably have to have the throttle all the way forward and stick it in a really steep dive to get anywhere near that sort of speed. And if you ever found yourself going at 300 miles an hour, it would probably be because you were dropping like a stone, having ripped the wings off the thing. Usually Stearmans cruise in the sort of 75 miles per hour to 90 mile an hour range, and if you want to do aerobatics in them, you usually put them in a little bit of a dive and get maybe 140, 130 miles per hour on the clock. So they're kind of the important speeds with a Stearman. Above the airspeed indicator, there is a turn and slip indicator. In Microsoft Flight, the turn and slip indicator works really well. It's very nice. It's a lot better in this sim than it is in a lot of other ones, so that is something particularly of note in this. It's great for hand flying because the turn and slip indicator works really well. To the right of that and a little bit below it, there is a combination gauge that is cylinder head temperature. You can see that that is redlined at about 90, and then you've got combination gauges there for oil pressure and fuel pressure. Below that and slightly to the left of it, you have an engine RPM gauge. This would have originally been in a Stearman, as opposed to the manifold pressure gauge that we saw before. This is calibrated again for installation in lots and lots of different aeroplanes, so it's calibrated to 3,500 RPM, but you can see that when it's in a Stearman, it's redlined at 2,300 RPM. Normally what you would do is, if you're running the engine cruising along, you wouldn't have it set on those kind of high RPMs. You'd probably have it around the 1,400, 1,500 RPM range for cruising along, so you kept the thing running nice and cool. The other important RPM speed on this to note is 800 RPM, which is the idling speed of most radial engines, and we'll see that when we start the engine up and go through a couple of checks. To the right of all that, there is, because this is depicted as a modern aeroplane, it's had some avionics added in the form of a little portable radio, and then to the right of that there is an electrical panel. Some Stearmans, particularly ones which were used for instrument training, did have an electrical system on them, and they'd have things like intercoms and batteries and maybe even electric starters. The vast majority of Stearmans didn't have much of an electrical system at all. The vast majority of them didn't have an alternator, quite possibly wouldn't have had a battery, although some of them would have. What they would have done is the engine would have been started with a hand crank, and then there would be a generator on the engine to supply any electrical power that it needed. So this is a depiction of an additional panel, although, as I say, you will find some Stearmans of the World War II era that have got an electrical panel in this location, but it doesn't look like this thing here. So got a few switches on there. Very first one, battery master. If we turn that on, you'll see that the voltmeter indicates that we're getting a little bit over 12 volts, so that's good. It means that we'd be able to start the engine. Then you've got an alternator. You want to switch the alternator on so that when the engine's running, the alternator will be generating some electricity to charge the battery. And then what you've got is lights. When I turn that on, you see it lights up the gauge, and it will be lighting up the gauges on the panel, but it will also be turning on the exterior lights on the thing. So there will be a light on the right wingtip, a light on the left wingtip, and there'll be one on the tail. And if we look on the external view, we should see those things lit up. So there you go. Port wing red light, starboard wing green light, and white light on the tail. Back in the cockpit and carrying on along that panel, we can see that what we've got is the next switch is the avionics master. We turn that on and the radio is going to light up. So if you want to use the ATC with this Boeing Stearman in Microsoft Flight, you can, because it's got a radio. And last but not least, we've got a starter button there. Now we noticed that when we started this, over on the left hand side looking at it, it hasn't got a fuel cutoff gauge. That is one of the things that's missing from this cockpit, and there are a couple of other things that are missing on the depiction from the cockpit. Nothing too important. One of them is Stearmans have control locks. They have a bunch of levers that you can pull, and that will stop the controls moving. It'll stop the rudder moving, it would stop the elevator moving, and it would stop the ailerons moving. That's so that if Stearman is parked in windy conditions, the wind won't blow the controls about and possibly damage them. They haven't depicted the control locks on this, but since we don't have to worry about wind blowing control surfaces in the flight simulator, it's not a big deal. The other thing that is not depicted on this, which you would find in the real aeroplane, is some straps to strap you in the seat. Obviously important in a biplane with an open cockpit, because if you did a loop, you don't want to fall out of the aeroplane. An important thing to note is that Stearmans of the period could be flown solo from the front or the rear cockpit, but if you were flying something solo, as is depicted on the exterior model with someone in the rear cockpit, it's certainly more common for someone to fly it solo from the rear cockpit. What you would have to do is, before you got in that rear cockpit and strap yourself in, what you'd have to do is you have to go and look in the front cockpit and tie the straps on the seat in front out of the way so that they wouldn't fall forward and jam up the controls. So there you go, real world tip on flying tandem seat aircraft. If you ever fly one solo, go in the other cockpit, tie the straps out of the way so they don't fall onto the controls, otherwise you might find yourself in trouble. Top real world tip there from Al. So there you go. If you have a look at a few Stearmans, you can see that this one is modelled with a metal joystick. Some Stearmans have wooden joysticks, some have metal joysticks. They can differ a little bit because they were made by lots of different companies and what have you, but this is a fairly typical depiction of a Stearman. However, some of the gauges have changed and some of the controls have changed to reflect the fact that it's had a replacement engine put on it. So let's go and start this thing up. To start it up, what we would need to do is make sure that the mixture is on fully rich. We'd make sure that the throttle was cracked open about an inch, just to give it a little bit of throttle, and we'll make sure, because this has got an electric starter, we'll make sure that both magnetos are selected. There's a different starting process for aeroplanes with a hand crank, and we'll see that on some of the other simulation versions that we look at. So having done that, all that remains is for me to press the electric starter button, and we'll get to hear the engine starter sound and the engine idling sound, which is, as you'll hear, pretty nice. So there it goes. You'll see that what's also depicted is a bit of smoke coming out of the engine as it starts up. Fairly typical for radial engines to do that, because what happens is a bit of fuel drips into the lower cylinders and a little bit of oil residue goes in there, and then what happens is when you crank up the engine, that gets shoved out into the exhaust manifold, and you get smoke emitting from the exhaust. So nice touch there, and quite a common thing to see on aeroplanes like this. Now, having started the engine on this, what we want to do is we want to let it idle for a bit in order that the engine can warm up a little bit. So you can see that the engine is warming up on this. We can see that the cylinder head temperature needle is moving up and up and up, and what you do is you let it idle until you've got a steady temperature. It should stop hopefully around about the maybe the 85 mark, not going past the red line. The engine will be being cooled by the backdraft from the propeller, but more cooling occurs when the thing's flying along from the airflow and stuff like that. So as long as this isn't going past the red line, we're okay, but you'll probably see the needle drop a little bit when we fly this thing around. Now, the other thing that we want to be aware of is that when we have let this thing warm up, so hopefully that needle is not going to go past that red line, and you can see it's settling. Hopefully what happens then is the engine will settle at about 800 RPM. What we need to be aware of is it won't do that unless got the throttle all the way back, and you can see that mine's sort of sticking a little bit. There it goes, that's gone on back a little bit, come on, sticking a little bit, but there you go, that's more or less idling. So let's take a look at the RPM that we're getting from that. It's maybe running a little bit faster than zero throttle, but we can live with that. So what you do is, when the engine is warmed up, what you do is you test the magneto system on the thing. Just see if I can get that throttle back a little bit. There we go, that's back a little bit better. The thing isn't rolling too much, and I'll just give it a touch of brakes to stop that. We should be idling at about 800 RPM. Now, there you go, you can see the needle is settling around the 800 mark there. That'll teach me to clean my throttle out a little bit on my joystick. To test the magneto system, what you do is this. You have a good look at the gauge and see that that is on 800, and then what you do is select one magneto rather than both of them. Now what you'll see is the RPM needle will drop a little bit because there's only one circuit providing a spark to the engine, but as long as that doesn't drop more than about 100 RPM, you know you're good to go. So having tested that, what you then do is you put it back on both, see that it picks up again, and you can see the needle just creeping up to 800 on the RPM gauge, and then what you do is you test the left system to see if the same thing occurs. A little bit of an RPM drop, as long as it's not more than 100 RPM, you know you're good. So you can see that the left and the right magnetos are both working on this thing. We put it back on both, we let the speed pick up to 800 RPM again, and once it's at a steady speed, what you then do is you briefly turn off the magneto to see if you could shut the engine down using the magneto if you had to. So there you go. The engine would have stopped if I'd left the magnetos off. It's not normally how you stop an engine like this. Normally how you stop an engine like this is you go onto the mixture lever and you take that back to fully lean, and then when the engine's shut down, then you cut off the magneto switch, and then when all of that's switched off, then you put the mixture lever back fully forward. That's the proper way that you do it. So if you want to fly a flight simulator Stearman or a real one, that's what you're supposed to be doing. So we can see 800 RPM on that. Everything seems to be working okay. You can see that the voltmeter is up a little bit past 12 volts, so it indicates that with the alternator's working and that's charging stuff. So we're all good to go. This thing looks great on the outside, it looks great on the inside, and it sounds pretty good as well. So let's see how the thing handles on the ground, and let's see how it flies as well. Now, the important thing with a Stearman or any tail dragger, as this thing is its ability to simulate how a tail dragger handles on the ground. Now, something important to note here, obviously a tail dragger sits on the ground with a tail wheel on the ground, but the centre of lift and the centre of gravity on the wings, usually the centre of gravity is about 1/3 of the way back from the leading edge of the wing. Of course, this is a biplane, so it's got two wings, so the centre of gravity on this thing is probably roughly in line with where the front unoccupied cockpit is, i.e. the centre of gravity is way behind the main wheels. So there's a lot of weight behind the main wheels. Now what that means is that if you are taking off or landing and you're rolling this thing along on its main wheels and the tail wheel isn't on the ground, you've got a lot of weight behind the wheels, and if I know a crosswind catches the tail and makes the thing start turning, it will pivot on its main wheels, and if you don't get on the rudder and counteract that, you can get so much swing going on that you won't have enough rudder control to be able to stop it happening, and then what will happen is the thing will spin round on its axis on the ground, and that is known as a ground loop. There are a few things that you can do to prevent that. The Stearman had a locking tail wheel. You can lock the tail wheel into position. Another thing that you can do is when the tail wheel's on the ground, you can hold back elevator on the thing, and that'll give it a bit of downforce. But the main thing to bear in mind to avoid ground loops is when they start to develop, get on them early with the rudder and cancel the things out. So let's see if this can simulate a ground loop, because although you wouldn't want a ground loop to happen in real life, because obviously it can cause damage to the airplane. In a simulator, you do, because it's part of the challenge of being able to fly the thing properly. So if this thing can simulate a ground loop, that will be a bonus. So let's try and make this thing ground loop. Now, to do that, I'm going to have to really abuse it and be a bit rough with the control. So obviously I wouldn't recommend that you do this kind of thing for real on an aeroplane, but of course the great thing about flight simulators is we don't have to worry about the cost of repairing things. We can just load the thing up again. So here we go, let's see if I can make this thing ground loop. So a bit of throttle, and then a bit of excessive turn. Oops, there you go. Now, you can see that certainly will make the wingtip scrape on the ground. So it'll depict that, but will it depict it? What can happen really badly with a biplane is if it starts to ground loop and turn really, really tightly, what will happen is it'll put a lot of stress on the landing gear, and if a wingtip hits the ground, particularly on grass, what it can do is it can dig into the ground, and then what that will do is that will make the thing flip over. Let's see if we can get it to do that. So a bit of power on the engine, and then oops, there you go. Obviously not recommended in real life. Now, one of the interesting things there is that unlike most flight simulators, when Microsoft Flight detects a crash, what it does is it doesn't just flash up something on the screen going, oops, you crashed. It actually plays out the entire crash. So that's kind of useful because you can kind of analyze what you did wrong. Now, another interesting thing with Microsoft Flight is normally with a lot of flight simulators, if something like this occurred, you'd be thinking, oh no, I've got to wait for it to load up again. Watch how quickly Microsoft Flight loads up. I've not speeded this up at all. I'm going to click on Fly now. Boom. Press the load screen, and there we are, back in the flight simulator. I bet you wish all flight simulators loaded up that quickly. Oh yeah. So let's get back in the cockpit. There we go. Now, you'll see what I mean about the turn and slip indicator on this. I'm going to put this into a turn. And the behaviour of the turn and slip indicator is very nice. It's a lot better than a lot of other flight simulators. That's a definite plus point for it. Another great plus point of this thing is that it does actually depict quite well the fact that biplanes are quite draggy. Anyone who's flown a biplane for real will know that when you come off the throttle, as I'm about to do here, I'll do that, you can see coming off the throttle, straight away what is going to happen is that propeller's going to start acting like a big brake, and because there's so many struts and wires and two wings and all this kind of stuff, this thing's going to start slowing down and the nose is going to drop. And that is sort of believable behaviour for a biplane, so that's quite nice. Another thing that you'd kind of like this to be able to depict is if you could side slip it, because one of the difficulties with tail draggers, and certainly when you're flying in the rear cockpit, is the forward visibility isn't that great. So one of the nice things that you can do with an aeroplane in those sorts of situations, and if you happen to get too high on approach, is you can side slip it. Now, to side slip an aeroplane, if you don't know how to do that, what you do is you use opposite stick and rudder. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put left rudder on and right aileron, like that. And what that will do is hopefully what that will do is if I put that on an external view, you should see this sort of sliding sideways a bit, like that. It's not an aerodynamically clean way for the aeroplane to fly. What it does do is, because it provides a bit more drag, it'll let you lose altitude and lose speed a little bit quicker. This isn't depicting the best side slip I've ever seen in a flight simulator. It's not terrible, but certainly coming off the throttle is a better depiction than the side slip. So swings and roundabouts there really. Now, something that you'll see pop up there, you'll see a little icon that says Coconut Daylight. that is, because in Microsoft Flight, as I say, it's got some gaming elements in it, it has points of interest, your score points, and your pilot's reputation improves when you visit various waypoints and stuff like that. If you do enough of that, what it does is it makes additional paint jobs for this aeroplane able to be used. So a few challenges in Microsoft Flight. Now, let's see how it handles aerobatics. Now, I'm going to do something that you wouldn't normally consider doing in a Stearman. I'm going to get the speed up to about 100 miles an hour. You can see there on the airspeed indicator, we're doing 100 miles an hour, and then I'm going to do this. Now, I should think it's rather unlikely that from 100 miles an hour level flight, a Stearman would perform a loop that well. Yeah, it would be struggling a bit, although this thing is depicted with a more powerful engine, so who knows, you know. I suppose it depends on how much fuel is on board the thing. But what would be a bit more convincing, certainly when it comes to how you do fly Stearmans when you do aerobatics, is this. I'll just get this lined up for the airfield because we don't want to get too far away from the airfield because we're going to bring this thing in for landing in a moment. This would be a more convincing way that you would fly a loop in a Stearman. Full throttle, get the nose down, let the airspeed build. The airspeed is approaching 140 miles an hour, and then up and over we go in a smooth movement, and I'll stick on an exterior view, and there, it's a lot less of a struggle for that to get over in a loop. So that's a typical entry speed for a loop in a Stearman would be 140 miles per hour rather than 100. That's be a bit of a challenge to perform a clean loop from a 100 mile an hour entry speed. Now, one of the things that you do tend to do in tail draggers like the Stearman is fly a curved approach. You can, as I say, you can side slip the thing in, so you can do this kind of thing and have the thing come in a little bit sideways. But another way that you can do it is you can fly a slightly curved approach so that you can keep the runway in sight. So I'm going to bring this thing in. So I'm going to chop the throttle. And maintain airspeed because we've got the nose down. And the correct technique for landing a Stearman, and certainly the way that they would have taught people in the United States Army Air Force and the United States Navy during World War II, is they would have expected them to do a three-pointer landing. There'd be none of that wheeler landing. You'd learn to fly the Army way or you wouldn't fly at all. And there was a fairly sensible reason for that too, because if you land it on the wheels, the moment that you stick the tail wheel down, there's quite a bit of weight transference, and that kind of invites the possibility of a ground loop. So it does make a lot more sense to try and three-point the thing. Now what that means is that you have to get this thing down and get the airspeed off when you're at quite a low altitude, so that you can stall it onto the ground. So we get this low, 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 and when it's very low over the ground, then what we do is we get the stick back, and hopefully, there you go, you three-point the thing like that. Very, very slight bounce there, but that wasn't a terrible landing. And then any tendency for this thing to veer off, what you do is you get on it quickly, and you can help this thing track straight if you keep the stick back so that there's a lot of weight on the tail wheel, and that'll keep the thing straight. That is how you're supposed to land one of these things. So, generally speaking, this flies pretty well. It's kind of nice. So, in looking at this thing, what I'm going to do is I'll get this thing off the runway. Notice that I am not turning this tightly because I don't want to stick a wingtip in the ground. But what I'm going to do is, using the criteria that I mentioned before, I think I'm going to mark it like this. Feel free to disagree with my assessment, but I think this is a fair appraisal of this thing. So that's choice number 1, default Stearman Microsoft Flight. Absolutely free to get hold of. Let's look at the next one. Okay, so here's the next Stearman that we're looking at, and again this one's free. But the simulator that it runs in is not free because this is for Laminar Research's X-Plane. Specifically I'm using X-Plane 11, the version I'm using is 11.31. I understand that this will work in X-Plane 10. You can try that. I can't say that I've checked it in X-Plane 10, but since it's free, if you download it, you'll be no worse off. And as far as finding it is concerned, it's relatively easy to come across. If you do a search on Google and type in free Stearman X-Plane, you'll come across this thing. Now, who made it and what's it about? What's it all about? So, as far as I'm aware, the model was made by a guy called Paolo Matricardi. The texturing is by Antonio Navarro, and there's another guy that's quite well known in the flight sim, certainly freeware world, and that's Lean de Jager, and I think he was involved in some of the flight modeling and testing and what have you. There might have been some other people involved in it, but those are the 3 that I know certainly were involved in it. So if you were involved in it as well and I didn't just give you a shout out, apologies, but these are the guys that I named are the guys that I know were involved in it. Now this is depicting a Stearman which was originally built in 1942, although it was rebuilt in I think 2013 by a company in Hungary, specifically for aviatrix Tracy Curtis Taylor, who intended to do some sort of historic record-breaking flights with it, and it was sponsored by Artemis Investments, so it was named Spirit of Artemis. This thing, unfortunately, the real aeroplane, was involved in quite a heavy forced landing in 2016 and quite badly written off, although you'll be pleased to know that Tracy and her passenger got out of that relatively unscathed. When you download this thing, you get a couple of paint jobs with it, but this is certainly the nicest of the paint jobs that's included with the thing. Again, because it's depicting a post-war sort of rebuilt and modernised Stearman, it's depicting it with an electric start. In this case it's a Lycoming R680 engine of 300 horsepower, not the original 220 horsepower. So this thing's depicted with an electric start. As you can see, it's a very nice model, and it's got some really lovely texturing. It's perhaps not quite as detailed a model as the one that we saw previously for Microsoft Flight, but it's not far off it. And texture wise, the fact that it's running in X-Plane, in this case X-Plane 11, is certainly helping it a lot, because if there's one thing that you can say about X-Plane is that it's a bit of a looker sim wise, certainly one of the better looking flight simulators, so that certainly helps things a lot. So yeah, it's a great model on the outside with some really nice detailing and some really nice texturing. Doesn't quite match that on the interior views. If we switch to an interior view, you can see that it's an adequate panel rather than a particularly beautiful one. There's none of the sort of detailed tubing and control push rods and all that kind of stuff depicted in there, although oddly enough it does depict straps on the seat, which the one in Flight didn't depict, although no joystick depicted, although there are rudder pedals depicted in the thing. So interior wise it's adequate rather than pretty. Externally it's really a very, very nice model. It depicts a relatively modern panel layout, so not as a Stearman would have been completely in 1942 or 1930s or what have you, but you know, it's got everything that you need in there. Notice that this thing has not got a propeller RPM control, so it's a little bit more authentic in terms of being like a Stearman that would have been around in the 30s and 40s, because it's just got throttle control and a mixture control. So let's get the thing cranked up and see what it sounds like. Just before we do that, I'll give it a quick flyby from left to right. So no fuel cutoff switch models like there wasn't on the Microsoft Flight Stearman. Throttle and mixture, magneto switches, altimeter, sort of combined engine temperature gauge there, airspeed indicator, altimeter. There's a clock, there's climb and dive indicator on there, turn and slip indicator, engine RPM gauge, and some switches for the electrics on there. There is also a carburetor heat switch there, and there's a little brake switch on the floor there, so you can turn the brakes on and off. So let's get this thing cranked up. So we know how to start these things. We would want the magnetos on, so we'll do that. So get that magneto switched on, and when I switch the magneto on, it's putting the mixture on fully rich for us there. And then what we need is the avionics on, and we need the battery on, and we need we don't need the nav lights on, but I'll turn them on anyway. And then because it's depicting an electric start, I'm going to use control 1, which will start engine number 1 in X-plane. So here we go, control 1. And there it goes. And you can see, or rather hear, that the engine sound is not the best. It's the same engine sound when we go on an exterior view as well. Now, as I say, not the best engine noise, but having said that, when we're on an inside view, I actually quite like the engine noise. And the reason I kind of like the engine noise is it sort of sounds to me a bit like the sound that you get when you're wearing a headset and a flying helmet, in that you get more of a sort of muted pulse rather than a sort of engine roar or what have you. So I kind of like it, even though it's not the best engine noise. It sort of kind of captures that feel to me. Feel free to disagree if you like, but I actually don't mind the engine from the inside. From the outside, not the best. So we know that this thing looks very, very pretty on the outside. Certainly beautifully textured and very nicely modelled. It's got some nice detail touches on it as well. You can see that it's depicting a bit of smoke coming out of the exhaust manifold there. Propeller animation, not the best, but you know, that's okay. So it looks great on the outside. Sounds okay, not brilliant, not great on the inside texturing and modelling wise, but certainly adequate. So let's go to our next criteria, which is how it depicts ground handling. Now, I am not the biggest fan of the ground handling in X-plane, and I don't think I'm alone in that. It can be a little bit iffy sometimes, but as we'll see, I'm going to abuse this a little bit and get it swinging. And what we'll see from this is that it does actually depict the inertia of a ground loop quite well. If I get that thing swinging round like that and then try and counter it with the rudder, you'll see that I can't. There's not enough rudder force to counter it. Which is actually quite realistic for the behaviour of a tail dragger. If you do get a bit of a swing going on a tail dragger, you've got to get on it quickly to stop that happening. So this thing sort of necessitates you managing the ground handling of a tail dragger quite well, to the extent that if the thing is getting a bit of a swing on it, you might even have to give it some throttle and some opposite rudder to get some airflow over the rudder in order to counter the swing. Now, it's not going to depict it pitching over on one of its wings. It doesn't matter how much you do this, it's going to remain firmly planted on the ground, so that's not that realistic. But as far as replicating swing and the difficulties of being able to control one, that's actually not bad. So there you go. Not totally realistic ground handling, but certainly enough going on to make it a bit of a challenge. So let's get this thing in the air. Internal view, and because of that I am going to have to use the rudder this thing tracking straight. Now, because this is depicting an engine with 300 horsepower, it's picking up speed fairly quickly. It's going to be quite sprightly because of that. You can see on the airspeed indicator that I'm already surpassing 100 miles an hour, 110, things fairly level, coming up to 120, which means that this thing is certainly going to be able to do this sort of thing. From level flight, you can quite easily loop it. Now, maybe a little bit too easily, but nevertheless, it does mean that you can chuck it about and have a bit of fun. So back in the cockpit, let's see how it depicts the dragginess of the biplane. So I'm going to chop the throttle, so you can see I've got the throttle completely back. Just trim it down a little bit, so we get the thing fairly level. See how much airspeed it loses. Now, it's certainly dropping when you come off the throttle, but it's not really depicting a lot of dragginess. I'm quite happily belting along at 75-80 there with the throttle backed off, and only in a fairly gentle glide. So that's perhaps not the most realistic behaviour ever. So I'm going to turn this thing around and head back towards the airfield. And let's bring it in for a landing. So there you go, we've got the airfield in sight now. What we'll see is whether you can side slip this thing. So, right rudder, left aileron. Oh, it doesn't really like cross controls very much. It's not a great depiction of that. And because it's not a great depiction of that, it's not really depicting the drag that would be induced from that slightly sideways flight. So, you're not really going to be able to side slip this thing in to lose height. So you're probably going to have to make sure that you get off the power fairly early on, because it doesn't depict losing a lot of speed from the drag. You can see there I've got the nose down, I've got the throttle right backed off, and this thing's wanting to do more than 90 miles an hour. So you're going to have to get the speed off this thing fairly early on to be able to bring it in. Got this over the runway. Now here I am, and at no point have I been on the throttle here. I'm getting this over the runway, and I'm holding it off and holding it off. 75, 70, down to 60. This thing still wants to fly. It's not losing speed. And it landed real easy. Now, would that all biplanes were that easy to land? So, yeah, perhaps not the best depiction of a flight model we've ever seen. But, as I say, redeeming features. It's very, very pretty. It's beautifully textured, and as with all free stuff, you certainly can't complain at the price. So if you've got to explain, it's worth a look. So I think what I'm going to do is using my sort of scoring criteria, I think I'm going to mark it like this. Now, as I say, feel free to disagree with me on the score, but I think that's a pretty fair appraisal of its upsides and downsides. And you've not got anything to lose in trying it if you've got X-Plane. So there you go. So that's 2 free Stearmans that we've checked out. The one that is in flight, that's completely free, and the simulator's free. We've got this one in X-Plane. Obviously you've got to buy X-Plane, but the aeroplane itself is free. So let's look at the other couple of options that we're going to look at, both of which are payware.
What was it I said before about not always dressing like this? Okay, now we're going to take a look at the various payware versions of Stearmans that you can get for flight simulators, and there are quite a few of them. On the face of it, it looks like there aren't that many, because there are 2 developers that have made payware Stearmans for flight simulators. That is Vertigo Studios and Golden Age Simulations. But both of those companies have taken the same approach in making their payware versions of Stearmans, in that they've split them into 2 volumes. So there's Volume 1 and Volume 2 from Vertigo Studios, and Volume 1 and Volume 2 from Golden Age Simulations. And you can kind of understand why, because there are a lot of different variants of the Stearman, from the original Model 75 civilian version, then the military versions for the Navy, floatplane versions, different versions with different engines for the US Army Air Force. Then after the war, when people started buying them when they were surplus, you had people putting different engines on them. There were replacement wings for them, there were modifications which added additional ailerons to them, then there's sort of additional body fairings and wheel fairings, engine cowlings, and then there are adaptations to turn it into a crop duster, all kinds of stuff. So you can kind of understand why both companies decided to split it into 2 volumes. But so I don't end up with this video being longer than War and Peace, because it's already quite a long video, what I've decided to do is take a look at the Vertigo Studios one and kind of combine Volume 1 and 2 and point out what you get generally speaking with it, and then do the same with Golden Age Simulations, and point out the sort of the general quality of it and the kind of features that you get overall in them. And just one other thing to note, in some of the previous sections of this video where you've seen some flight simulator aircraft telling the story of the development of the Stearman, quite a few of those that you saw were payware Golden Age Simulation add-ons. So if you're curious about them, again, it's probably worth taking a look at the Golden Age Simulations website. But anyway, let's crack on and have a look at the payware Stearmans that you can get. Ready? Let's go.
Okay, so here's the first of the payware Stearmans that we're going to take a look at, and this is from Volume 1 of the Vertigo Studios Stearman, which this originally came out in late 2011. So compatibility wise, Vertigo Studios say it's for FSX, but I can assure you that this thing works in FSX, FSX SE, the Steam version, and all versions of Lockheed Martin's P3D, because I've got this thing running right now in Lockheed Martin P3D version 4, no problem whatsoever. So if you're concerned about compatibility, pretty much doesn't matter which Microsoft flight simulator you've got, as long as it is either FSX or P3D, this thing's going to work. This Volume 1 costs 15 quid in the UK. Sometimes you see it discounted, but 15 quid, so probably about $20 if you wanted to get hold of this. Now, as you can see, this is a very nice model. It's perhaps not up to the standard of something that would come out this year, but you have to bear in mind that this thing was done nearly 10 years ago, 2011. That's getting on time-wise, and it is a very nice model. Pretty high polygon, no sort of rough edges on it. It's an accurate depiction of the aeroplane. The texturing stands up pretty well to close inspection. You've got nice modelling of the engine there. So yeah, it's pretty good. Now then, when we get to the inside, so switch to the inside view, Again, stands up pretty well on the inside too. It's roughly comparable to the standard that we saw on the Microsoft Flight one, in that movement of the push rods on the controls is depicted, so everything's sort of moving around there and what have you. When we move the trim wheel, you can see that the cables are animated moving and stuff like that. When I move the mixture control, you can see that the sort of push rod that would go to the carburetor is animated and all this kind of stuff. So it's very nice, pretty authentic. It's got the straps on the seat. It's got the little fire extinguisher that would have been originally in the thing in World War II. This thing is depicted with a wooden joystick, as very many of them did have. Some of them had metal ones. So yeah, completely authentic looking. So let's see what it models controls wise and detail wise. You know, texturing wise, it's modeling wise, it's pretty nice. So we've got a trim control that works okay. We've got the throttle quadrant, essentially a sort of World War II 1930s era throttle quadrant. So no propeller, RPM control, purely mixture and throttle. That's okay, you know, it's that's the kind of authentic PT13, PT17 and N2 sort of setup, if you will. So nothing wrong with that. There's an additional lever here which is not modelled in the ones that we've seen previously, and this is one of the flight control surface locks. So we can click on that, move that down, and then the control surfaces will not move. I am moving my joystick and nothing is happening. So I would need to unlock that. Boom, and it's unlocked. Now what we've also got is the fuel cutoff switch there, which is modelled. I'm going to put that on because we're going to be starting this in a moment or two. And I've also left the mixture control fully forward, so that's alright. We've got a magneto control. Magneto control works, so we can move that thing, and I'm going to put the magnetos on both because we're going to be starting it in a moment. Now, a slight departure from authenticity here is, if this was a World War II Stearman, and certainly a military one, it probably would have been started with a hand cranked inertia starter, and then you'd put the magnetos on. This thing is depicted with an electric starter switch there. It's probably because of a limitation on FSX more than anything. We'll more on that in a little while when we look at one of the other payware Stearmans. Now, moving across the panel, this is about as basic as you can get, and that's fairly authentic. So we've got an altimeter, airspeed indicator, temperature gauge, RPM gauge for the engine, compass. That's your lot. Pretty basic, but then again, this is a basic trainer, so what else do you need? Moving across, there is another switch on the panel that we can see here, which is not functioning on this variant, but it does function on some of the variants in this package that we'll see to operate things like the smoke and the sort of fertilizer deployment on crop duster versions and stuff like that. So that switch not doing a lot on this version, but does on the other ones. We've got another switch here which is carburetor heat, and another switch here which is the parking brake, and then apart from this panel here, that's about your lot. So looking at this panel here, what we've got here is we've got a panel spotlight, so you can fly the thing at night. We've got three switches, one for the navigation lights, one for the sort of tail lights, and then this thing here which is the battery switch that will enable the starter to work. So all of these things work, tail light, navigation lights and battery switch. And because we're going to start this thing in a moment, boom, let's get the electrics on. So let's check that we're good to start. Mixture control fully forward, throttle slightly cracked open, magneto switch is on, fuel switch on, so here we go. And there you go. Reasonably good engine sound. I'm going to get the stick back, and I'm going to hold the brakes on, and then I'm going to rev it a little bit so you can get an idea of the sound. And then let's have a look at that outside and a listen. Now you can kind of hear the clanking and stuff like that going on, particularly when the engine's running at idle. So I think that's a pretty nice engine sound. That's reasonably authentic then. Let's go back on the interior. We can see that this thing is idling pretty slowly, but it's alright. And if we start messing around with magneto switches, we can test to see whether that'll drop off. So you can see that, yes, that is dropping off. I'm not going to do the full test on this. You know that this thing works okay. Nice on the inside. And nice on the outside. And with good engine sounds. All of the controls and what have you are duplicated in the front cockpit. So if you shifted position, you could fly this from the front cockpit if you wanted to. So let's zoom out the view a little bit. And let's see how this thing handles on the ground, because we're going to follow the same criteria as we did with the other ones that we checked out. So let's pop it on the external view and we'll zoom out a little bit so we can see what's going on. And I'll abuse this and see how it handles on the ground, because we want to see how this thing handles ground looping and stuff. So let's move this thing off. Abuse this thing with a bit of bad taxiing. Get it out here so that I don't crash into any of the lamp posts or anything like that. And then see if we can stand it on its wing. So there you go, you can see that it is possible to get this thing to sort of scrape a wingtip and what have you. But regardless of whether you've got detect crashes turned on in FSX or P3D, scraping a wingtip will not trigger a crash. About the only way that you can actually get this to crash is if you stand on the brakes and flip it over on its nose. So it's perhaps not the best depiction of how a Stearman handles on the ground. Doing what I was doing there, I'm pretty sure would have ground looped that quite badly and probably damaged it to the extent that you wouldn't want to go flying in it. So not the best ground handling wise. There you go. And believe me, I have the realism settings in P3D and everything on full throttle realism here, with the exception of crash detection, because as I say, if I nose this thing over, it's just going to freeze the sim. It's not going to really depict a realistic crash or anything like that. So let's get this thing on the runway. There. Get it lined up, and away we go. And up we go in the air. Now I'll just trim this a little bit. And I'll come back on the throttle. Now, a Stearman of this era with the original 220 horsepower engine would not like it if you maintain that kind of RPM for a long time. You'd probably want it around about 1,450 RPM, something like that. And this thing should be able to fly along reasonably nicely, more or less level, at about 70, something like that. It will depend on how much fuel you've got on board. I've got 100% fuel on this, so it is quite heavy. This thing should fly pretty much like it is doing. It's sort of settling to about 70, 75 on 1450 RPM, and it's having a reasonable stab at maintaining altitude. So flight model wise, that's right on the money. Pretty good. If we put the throttle up again, get some speed up. What should not happen with this is from 100 knots it shouldn't really manage a loop too easily, not with a full fuel load on board, so let's see how that goes. Only just makes it. Doesn't come out of the loop very clean. And loses a fair old bit of altitude. So that is a pretty good depiction of how the thing flies. Not bad that. If you really do want to do aerobatics on a Stearman that is of this vintage, you would really need to be doing this kind of thing. Getting the nose down. See the airspeed indicators going, passing through 120. Getting to 130, it's getting near 140. That's really where you want to be entering a loop. And then of course, you still got a little bit of airspeed on the clock. So, you know, if you wanted to continue the loop, you'd come back off the throttle. But I had enough airspeed for the ailerons to roll us a little bit and get us the right way around. So, let's see what happens when we cut the throttle. So I'll come back on the throttle. See there, on the throttle quadrant, I'm all the way back with it. It's wanting to pitch up to keep flying. So I'm going to have to get the nose down a little bit. And it is losing a lot of speed, but a lot of the speed it's losing is because it's pitching up. So that is, you know, it's perhaps not 100% realistic, but it certainly is losing speed. And now it's starting to lose altitude because I'm getting to the point where there's nothing on the clock but the maker's name. As you say when your engine comes out. Now, I get the throttle back on. It's kind of waking up and smelling the coffee a little bit. Let's see how this thing can side slip. We're a little bit low to try a side slip, so I think what I'll do is I'll bring it round in a turn. Now, one of the things you might have noticed is that sound-wise, this has quite a good depiction of airflow noise, because in a Stearman, or any biplane really, you've got a lot of flying wires, you know, struts and what have you, and they do make a lot of aerodynamic noise. So it's depicting that pretty well. Sound-wise, this thing's pretty good. So we should get the airfield in sight in a second. And we're up at about 1,000 feet, which is going to be way too high for a landing, but it will let us try a side slip. See how we get on with that. So here comes the airfield in sight again. We are way too high for an approach, so I'm going to chop the throttle and then down there. So to do a side slip, you want rudder one way, stick the other way. I'm not going to do that without looking out the window, but that's what I'm doing here. I'm sticking full right rudder on, and you see if you overcook it, you will make this thing spin at low speed, so you can't abuse it too much. That was getting ready to go into a spin there. So let's try a side slip on this thing. Right rudder, left aileron. Let's get this thing flying sideways. And there you go, you can see this thing is kind of well and truly flying sideways there. But I would expect this to be losing altitude a bit more drastically than it is doing. It is losing altitude, but it's not perhaps dramatic as it would be in real life, particularly considering that I've got a full fuel load on board. So not the best depiction of a side slip, but not the worst. So let's bring this thing in for a landing. I'm getting the airspeed off. And there it goes. Yeah, it's relatively easy to 3-point here, but as we've seen, it's not got the most realistic depiction of the propensity for a tail dragger to ground loop. So, you know, yeah, you can tail wheel land the thing, you can 3-point it, but you're getting away with a bit there, to be honest. Now then, let's take a look at some of the other ones that you get in this add-on and some of what you get in Volume 2. Okay, so this is one of the agricultural variants from Volume 2 of Vertigo Studios Stearman. So it's depicted with a Jacobs engine of 300 horsepower. So this thing's got a bit more oomph about it, and you can see there's got some nice animations going on with the diffusers for the spray bar and stuff like that. And what I can tell you about this is that the flight model does depict the weight of the spray stuff that you've got on board, and it depletes realistically, and you can actually refill that from within the sim if you want to. If you go to the menu here, you can see that there is a little auxiliary panel there, and you can refill the tank if you want to. Because it was reloading the sort of fertilizer that it was carrying, it sort of reset everything and put the throttle on again. Now, so again, a very nice model, and it's got sort of like some depictions of the changes that take place for an agricultural one. And when we go on to the internal view and have a look at this, you can see that now we have a switch that will function, and this switch, if I can get the tilted to pop up, there you go, spray on off. So you can realistically use this for spraying. Now that's kind of cool because what it means is that if you are familiar with Lorbe's add-ons for flight simulators, and if you're not, you should be, because he's a really great developer, does a lot of free stuff. Do a search for Lorbe flight simulator stuff. Well worth a visit to his website. Loads of really great stuff on it. Some payware stuff, some free stuff. So loads of cool free stuff to download. Loads of great payware stuff as well that isn't actually that expensive. And one of them is a little crop duster game that you can put in FSX and P3D, and it's great fun. So this is, you know, perhaps one of the ideal aeroplanes that you want to try in that. So you might want to check that out. So if you're thinking, well, why would you want a crop duster in your flight simulator? Because you can get a crop dusting add-on for it. That's why. So a little plug there for Lorbe. So this thing will depict throwing out fertilizer when you fly it. So let's get this thing in the air. Now you can see that's kind of sluggish to move off. It's got a full fuel load on, and a full hopper, so you have to be real careful about how you fly this when it's fully loaded, because it's, despite the fact that it's got a 300 horsepower engine, it can be sluggish with a full load on board. And if we hit the switch for the spray bar, so I'll just pop back in the cockpit, boom, turn that thing on, and then look back outside. You can see that that thing is now dumping agricultural spray. And what would happen if I fly this around enough is eventually the hopper would get empty and the thing would fly a lot better. So that's actually really rather nice that it does that. So that's one of the other variants that you can get from Vertigo Studios. But you should bear in mind that this is one from the second volume. Now, you can buy the second volume as a standalone if you want, and that'll cost you similarly 15 quid if you're in the UK, or around about $20. Or if you bought volume 1 of Vertigo Studios Stearman, you'd get a discount for buying volume 2, and you'd get it for, I think, about 10 quid, which would be, I don't know, maybe $10, $12, something like that. So, you know, it doesn't cost you a fortune to get hold of all of them. And interestingly, this is one of the few depictions of a Stearman that you can get where it has a 300 horsepower Jacobs engine. Lots of them depict Lycoming and Continental engines and all that kind of stuff. And some of them Wasp Juniors, but this is about the only way that you can get yourself a Jacobs engine version. That's kind of interesting. Now, I'll just show you a couple of the other ones, and then what we'll do is we'll determine how we're going to mark this thing. So, another version that you can get is a float plane. So if you're into that bush plane thing, you can get yourself a float plane. Just bear in mind that with the Vertigo Studios add-ons, the agricultural crop duster versions and the float planes are in volume 2. So you could either buy volume 1 and volume 2, and then in which case you definitely have this thing, or you can just get volume 2 on its own and purely have the agricultural and the float plane version. As you can see, pretty nice. And if we come in the cockpit, you can see there isn't much variation in the virtual cockpits that they use. You can see that we've lost the little switch to turn on the crop duster spray, but beyond that, the real difference between them is mostly what avionics they've got. And so we'll see that in a second, because another one that you can get is this thing. Now this, go back in the cockpit, is a depiction of a souped up modern Stearman. And so what it depicts, again, is a 300 horsepower Jacobs engine. Not that you can see it in this case because it's got a cowling on it, but if you want a Stearman that does aerobatics, then this is kind of going to be your choice. And this thing also depicts, if I switch to an external view, the smoke oil system. So that obviously you can turn on or off. Now, being very streamlined, because it's got wheel spats on it and stuff like that, this thing will do far more than 100 knots in level flight. You can see there, this thing, I've got throttle to the firewall, and in level flight, this thing's doing 135 miles per hour. And that's with a full load of fuel on board, so it will enable you to do this kind of thing. Stick that in a dive, pull it up. You can get away with going vertical in this for quite some time. Without it dropping out of the sky. And you might also notice But this thing has ailerons. On the upper and the lower wing. See them going. So it's got a much better roll rate. So if you want a Stearman for aerobatics, then this is great. Now, what that means is that Volume 1 of Vertigo Studios Stearman add-on, I should say, is pretty good value because it gives you a historic version of it, and quite a lot of paint jobs, and it also gives you a modern version of it that you can check about. So you kind of get the best of both worlds with that. But if you want some more specialised Stearmans, float planes or crop dusters, you're going to be into Volume 2. But since you can get Volume 2 for 10 quid and Volume 1 for 15 quid, this means that you can buy both of them and you're still only paying 25 quid, and you are getting a lot of variants, a lot of planes and a lot of paint jobs for that kind of money, that work in FSX and P3D, any version. So I think it represents pretty good value for money. So let's bring this thing in for a landing. So graphically, it's nice. Not going to set the world alight looks-wise, but you know, it's a nice model and it's nicely textured, and you get a lot of paint jobs with it. They're well done. Sound-wise, it's very good. You can hear that sort of whistling wind noise as I come in for a landing here. So overall, it's pretty good. Down on the runway. And there we go. Not a terrible landing. Perhaps not my best one, but no, I didn't crash it. So I think overall, and I'm just going to give it kind of like an overall score based on the fact that I've looked at Volume 1 and Volume 2. I think overall, I think this is a pretty fair score for this. And as I said with all the other stuff, feel free to disagree. But yeah, I think that's pretty fair. Even the engine stopping sounds quite nice on that, doesn't it? Anyway, on to the next one. So now we're looking at the Golden Age Simulations version of the Boeing Stearman. And as already noted, this comes in 2 volumes as well. Volume 1 covers M2 Navy versions, PT-13s and PT-17s. Volume 2 has airshow variants with soup-to-nuts engines, crop dusters and float planes. So broadly similar to what Vertigo Studios did with theirs in the way that they split them. The difference is that this is certainly a more recent simulated version. First volume of it came out in late 2018. The second volume came out early 2019. So this one is certainly the most recent of all the simulated Stearmans that you can get for flight simulators. Now, as you'd expect, with it being the most recent one, it's the most expensive one. Each volume costs, I think, around 22 quid, so that's around about $24-25. So volume 1, 20 odd quid, volume 2, 20 odd quid. But with it being the most recent one, as you can probably imagine, it's the one that's got the most whistles and bells, and it is the one that is compatible with P3D and FSX. And we're looking at this one in P3D, but this is sort of absolutely compatible with all of those simulators. Now, as you might also expect, for that kind of money, it's the one that's got the most whistles and bells as well. So let's take a look at it. So what we're looking at here is obviously an army version. As I say, this thing covers PT-13s and PT-17s and Navy N2 variants, and they're all kind of broadly similar, so we'll just get an idea of what this thing looks like. As you can see, it is, again, a very nice model, and it's nicely textured, and again, if we zoom in, you can see that the texturing stands up to very close inspection, because this has, being the more recent one, this has got 4096 textures on it. You can install lower resolution versions if you want, but this one's probably the most sort of souped up texture wise. It's a nice model, and you can see that the engine model is very detailed. Now, I'll be honest with you, I'm a bit of a fan of Golden Age simulations, but even I would say that their texturing is probably not their strong point. They don't really tend to do sort of a lot of weathering on things. But then again, a lot of Stearmans that you see these days, they're sort of beloved vintage aeroplanes, so the vast majority of them are very well looked after these days, so it is kind of rare to see a grotty one, and some of the textures that that are in their package are a bit roughed up and what have you, but I personally think that Golden Age simulations, their texturing is not their strong point. The simulation and the modelling is kind of the strong point of it, but you know, as with all of them, you get a paint kit, so you could play around with that if you wanted to. So you can see that this thing has a World War II era paint job, and it's a nice model, both inside and out. So there's the outside. Let's take a look on the inside, and here we go, virtual cockpit of the Golden Age Simulations one, and again, a very nice and realistically simulated interior. This one's even got the parachute on the seat, although it hasn't got the straps. Now, this is a completely authentic 1930s World War II era simulated virtual cockpit. It works in exactly the way the real thing does, even down to the starting, which we'll see in a minute. So let's just take a look at this virtual cockpit from left to right. So you've got fire extinguisher there. Obviously the fire extinguisher doesn't do anything, but it's in there, so that's kind of alright. And then what we've got is we've got the elevator trim, then you've got the throttle quadrant with only two controls, so authentic to the period, the throttle control and the mixture control. So I'm going to put the mixture on fully rich, and again you can see that this is animating the control rod and cable movements and stuff like that, so that's nice. And that's also true of all of the sort of bars and connectors for things like the rudder pedals and what have you. So again, a very, very detailed cockpit. Now, also modelled on this are the control locks, which do lock the controls, and we've seen what that actually does. I'm moving the control sticks and nothing's moving there, so obviously what I need to do is I need to take the control locks off, like that, and now they're freed up. And then we have the fuel cutoff switch, which is modelled, so I'm going to put that on, and then above that we've got the magneto switch, and I'm going to put that on, and we're going to be starting this in a minute, so I'm going to put that on, although strictly speaking you might not actually have that on if you were starting this thing up. It depends on the start procedure that you wanted to go with, but we'll see that in a minute, because this thing has a fully authentic starting mechanism on it, which is one of the nice features of it. So we've got an airspeed indicator, an engine tachometer or RPM gauge if you want to call it that, a magnetic compass, turn and slip indicator, there's a clock, we've got an altimeter, and we've got a combined temperature gauge and what have you. So there's a manifold pressure gauge on the right hand side there, which kind of comes into play on some of the souped up variants that you see. Below that you have parking brake switch, you've got carburetor heat switch. Carrying on across to the right, you've got panel lights, you've got navigation lights, you've got generator switch, and then you've got the battery switch. Now we're going to start this in a minute, so we'll be turning that on in a moment. But this thing also features something that a lot of a lot of the other Stearman models don't actually feature, in that this one does actually have a tail wheel lock switch. Now, obviously, when it comes to tail draggers, it's occasionally helpful to lock the tail wheel to help you track straight down the runway. You can use it or not use it, but this is authentic in that there is a tail wheel lock model on the thing. Now, to start this thing, we need to make sure that the mixture control is fully forward. We can crack the throttle open a little bit, like that. We can make sure that the magneto switches are on. We probably want to get all of the electrical switches on, like that. And there is no starting switch here because this thing has sort of an authentic starting method. And to start this thing in an authentic fashion, you go here on the engine cowling. Now, on the engine cowling of a Stearman, more modern versions, they've have this thing fed over. Some of them leave it intact and what have you, and then they've got an electrical starter. But originally, a Stearman would have had an inertia starter. So I'm going to explain what's going on with this panel here. Now, there's a few things. The first thing that we could see, up in the top right hand corner, you can see the oil cap. You can unscrew that and you can look inside, and there's a dipstick attached to it. You can't do it in this simulated version, that's on the real thing. But what you've also got is this thing here, just up above where it says 611, and this is a simulation of the inertia starter system. Now, what would actually happen in real life is somebody would stand around about here, typically behind that bracing wire there, to prevent them from falling into the propeller when they're winding the inertia starter. But we can do it from here because there's no danger that we're going to get minced up by the propeller. Although, you know, another top real-world tip from Al: if ever you are on the ground near aeroplanes with propellers, always, unless you know different, always treat the propeller as though it's live and it could start at any moment. Stand well clear of it. Things can start by accident. You know, someone can get in the cockpit, knock a switch and what have you. So, just as a general safety thing in the real world, stay away from the propeller unless you really have a reason to want to go near the thing. So, there are 3 switches here. We've got an engine primer here. So, what you would do is you would prime the engine a few times, like that. And then you would insert this hand crank, and you would wind the hand crank, and what that will do is that will spin a heavy flywheel up to about 12,000 RPM, and then what you can do is you can engage that via a clutch to the crankshaft. That will turn the engine, and then what you can do is you can fire the thing up. So let's do that. Are we ready? And there you go. That's how you really start a Stearman, particularly one of the kind of 1930s World War II vintage. So this is the only simulated version that does actually do that. So it is kind of nice, and that's what I was talking about when I was saying this thing's got a lot more whistles and bells. There's plenty more than that, as we'll see. Now, the inertia starter handle. There are 2 places that would be stowed. On some Stearmans, you open up this panel and there's a little clip that you can store it in. On other Stearmans, it's stored in a little luggage compartment behind the rear cockpit. So, I'm going to go to this instrument panel, configuration manager, and you've got the baggage compartment there, which I'm going to tip. And you can see that that's opening up. On some Stearmans, the cranking handle is stored there. On some, it's under that panel there. So there you go. You can see that one of the things this Golden Age simulation Stearman comes with is it comes with this little panel where you can turn various things on and off. So we can turn the pilot on or the pilot off, the passenger on or off. We can have a pilot in the VC. We can close the baggage compartment. We could choose to display a GPS or not a GPS in the cockpit. We can put on wheel chocks. So you see those things appear. You can put tie downs on the thing. You can put a cockpit cover on the thing. You can put pitot cover on. You can see that just appeared on the left wing strut. And you've got control locks that you can put on or off, and we've seen that those do function when you put the thing on. So, I think what we will have on this is, otherwise it's going to look a little bit weird, I think we'll have a pilot on the external view, otherwise it'll look like a ghost flying the plane. So back in the cockpit, this is a very, very nice, completely authentic virtual cockpit. Everything's sort of fully realistic on the thing. So it's the most authentic of the cockpits of any of the flight simulator versions that you can get, and includes that authentic method for starting it. Now, and I can assure you that all of the sort of magneto checks and all that kind of stuff, this thing works and simulates all that correctly. So just make sure that I've got the control locks off, and you can see that I have. So let's get this thing out and see how it handles. So sound wise, it's pretty good. Good engine starting sounds and what have you. Good on the external view, good on the internal view. It looks great. So the next thing that we need to check is what this thing's like at ground handling. Now, I could save a bit of time here by telling you that as far as ground handling is concerned, and its ability to simulate ground looping and what have you, it's broadly similar to what we saw with the Vertigo studios in Stearman, in that if I abuse this thing a bit, you can see that the behavior is broadly similar. It doesn't really want to run away, and as we saw on the X-plane freeware Stearman, that does simulate the sort of tail running away a little bit better. So this thing, as far as ground handling is concerned, is virtually identical to the Vertigo Studios one. Ground handling, you know, and the ability to ground loop it, not the best. Anyway, let's get this thing lined up for the runway. We'll go in the cockpit view, and we'll get in there. And up it goes. Now you'll notice that as I move the view around, I got the kind of buzzsaw sound when I was at the side of the aeroplane. So this thing has slightly better exterior sounds from various quarters. When you view the thing, you get a more three-dimensional sound with this one than you do with the Vertigo Studios one. So there's not much in it, but you know, I would say that this one slightly edges it in terms of sound. Now, back with the throttle. At about 1500, 1450 RPM. You can see that this thing will fly along at around about 70, 75 knots, and it will maintain altitude. So this thing's bang on the money as well, in terms of how the engine affects the cruise speed and what have you. And if I get this thing up to about 100 knots, now this thing's got a full fuel load on board, and it's simulating an original Stearman with a 220 horsepower engine, which is no rocket ship by any stretch of the imagination. It was a primary trainer. So I think the way that this thing builds speed, excuse me, I think that the way this thing builds speed is a little bit more believable. It takes a while for it to build speed, and you probably have to be level or stick it in a dive. So here we go, we've got about 90 miles an hour on the clock. I'm just going to put the nose down a little bit to get us to 100 knots, and then I'm going to put it in a loop and we'll see how it does. So there we are, we're hitting 100 knots. And that was running out of airspeed as it came over the top of the loop. So this thing's pretty believable in terms of its aerobatic capabilities. If I pop this thing into more of a dive, and the nose down, 130 knots, and then come up and over. With more airspeed, we were okay when we got to the top of the loop. Now you will notice that this thing, when I put it into a dive to get the speed on, took a little bit longer to get up to 130 knots, and we were kind of running out of room altitude wise, so I had to be happy with 130 knots. I couldn't let it get to 140, and that is very much more believable behaviour for a Stearman. If you've flown a Stearman for real, or any old biplane that's kind of like it, but particularly the Stearman is a big heavy aeroplane. Those things are built like tanks, and they've got struts and wires all over the place, and so they slow down when you get the power off, and they are very, very draggy when you've got the power off. So this thing is flying like a real Stearman, certainly behaving a lot more like a Stearman than other ones. So let's get the power off. See what that does to things. Now you can see with the power off, particularly if I hold the nose up, so this thing's really starting to lose speed fairly rapidly. And it's getting very sloppy on the controls too. It's getting to the point where you probably would spin it if you started trying to pull any fancy maneuvers. So We get some speed on. Get the nose down. Get us out of that. So I think the dragginess of this is a little bit more believable. Let's see what it's like in a side slip. I'm sticking left rudder on, right aileron. See how that does. That's definitely affected by drag a bit more than all the other simulated Stearmans we took a look at. So as far as flight model is concerned, I think this one's the winner. It's a much more believable flight model for an original Stearman. They weren't rocket ships, they were training planes, big heavy training planes, and they would slow down and get very draggy if you didn't put power on. So anyway, let's bring this thing in for a landing. Now you might notice that my view was tilting a little bit when I went into the turn. And that's not the Golden Age Simulation Stearman that's doing that. And it isn't P3 that's doing it. What it is it's the freeware camera utility chase plane. And if you're not familiar with chase plane, you want to check it out because it has some nice features like that, and it makes things like flying stuff like this Stearman a little bit nicer because you kind of automatically sort of lean into the turn. You can play around with how the camera behaves, and it's definitely helpful on things like this. So you know, don't be. And I could have done that with the Vertigo Studios Stearman as well. So it's not unique to this. You'll recall the Vertigo Studios Stearman had quite a nice wind noise sound at this stage of the landing. I think that was one audio aspect of the Vertigo one that was a little bit better. So we're going to bring this thing in. Now, of all of the ones that we've looked at, I think this one is certainly one of the ones that lands in a more realistic fashion because of the way it bleeds off speed when you've got the engine backed off. So that's the kind of bog standard Stearman that you get from Golden Age Simulations. But before we finish up looking at this one and mark it and what have you, let's have a look at a few of the other ones that you get. So here's one of the airshow variants from Golden Age Simulations, and you'll remember that I was saying that it tips the scales in terms of whistles and bells. So here's what I mean by that. So we've got wheel chocks that you can put on, We've got tie downs that you can put on. You can put the cockpit cover on if you want to. Pitot tube cover, control locks, passengers. But what we can also do on this is we can remove the engine cowling like that, so you can see the engine. We can take the wheel pants off, so you can see that. We can give it a wing walker, and we can take the headrest off the back, so we can have slightly more streamlined or less streamlined ones. So a lot of whistles and bells. Now this thing is a replication of an airshow variant with a Pratt & Whitney Wasp Junior. So you can see that that thing has an electric starter. It also has a propeller control. So the Golden Age simulations, Stearmans, do have very different cockpits depending on which version you're talking about. And I'm sure you can hear that that thing sounds different as well. So they haven't just gone for one sound on this thing, they've gone for authentic sounds. If we take a look on the outside and listen to that. Definitely a different engine sound there. And definitely different behaviour in terms of the kind of speeds that it can attain. There we are in level flight. In fact, we're in ever so slightly a climb with a full fuel load, and this thing is gradually creeping up towards 130 knots, and probably would keep going up to about 140 if we gave it enough time. So when you get on an external view, this thing will quite happily let you throw it about. Keep in mind that the airshow versions are in the second volume of Golden Age Simulations add-ons, and also in there are crop duster variants and the float planes. So let's take a look at one of the crop dusters. So here we are in one of the Golden Age Simulations crop dusters, and you might notice something a bit different about the virtual cockpit. Where the hell are the instruments? Well, the instruments are up there on the wing. The reason they do that is so that you can keep your head up. Because if you're flying a crop duster, you're at low altitude and you don't want to be getting your head down in the cockpit. That's a real nice touch. And you'll recall that what we've got is this thing here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go on the external view. We'll have a look at some of the things you can mess around with. So bring that panel up. You can clip the wings. You can put the spray bars on. You can put a spreader box on the bottom. You can put a rollover hood on. So you can really customize how your crop duster actually looks. So again, you can see there I am spray actually working. Turn that off. So again, if you are considering Lorby's crop duster add-on, and you should, it's very cool, then this is another option for you. And it allows you to customize things a lot. Clip wings, spreader box, take the spray bars off, take the roll-over hood off. Again, the crop duster variants are in the Golden Age Simulation Stearman Volume 2, and also in that are these. And interestingly, as we've seen, this thing isn't missing its whistles and bells either. If we bring up the little panel there, you can see that you can put mooring lines out for the thing. Kind of nice touch. And the virtual cockpit is different on this one as well. If we look inside, it's broadly similar, but what we have is this control here for the water rudder. So I can pull that and the water rudders are up, do that and they get lowered. So they've kind of gone for it. In terms of different virtual cockpits, there are a lot of them. And they are specific to each version. So there you go, Golden Age Simulations Stearman variant in 2 volumes. And so I think, overall, I'm going to score it like this. And as I said with every other one, feel free to disagree with me. Ultimately, you can make your own decision on it. This is just kind of like a guide to help you a little bit without you having to spend the money, because obviously, you know, to get hold of all of these ones to do the review, that would be, let me add that up, nothing for flight, so that one was free. X-Plane is it's about 50 quid. P3D and FSX will have had them ages anyway, so I'm going to kind of discount the cost of those, but yeah, you know how that works, and FSX is fairly negligible on price, so yeah, I mean, you can find that discounted to a tenner and stuff like that, so I'm not going to really count that, but it would be around about 25 quid for both of the Vertigo Studios Stearmans, and about £44 for the Golden Age Simulation one, so we're looking at 65-70 quid to find out all this stuff. And I didn't get these for free, you know, they didn't send me them or anything like that. I bought these things and decided to do reviews on them and stuff like that, you know. If any developers do want to send me stuff for free, feel free to do so, but yeah, this is kind of intended to help you out a little bit rather than you having to spend all the money. But certainly check out the Microsoft Flight one. That won't cost you anything. And if you've got X-Plane, check out the freebie Stearman that you can get from that, because as we've seen, that's quite nice.
So there you go, that was Chock's Hangar, episode 1, if you prefer to call it that. Now, I deliberately used a lot of different presentation styles for this video. Some of it direct to camera with script, some of it direct to camera with not much of a script at all, other than just a sort of general idea of what I was going to talk about. Video overlaid over stuff that was very heavily scripted, video overlaid over things that were not scripted at all, and so on and so forth. And I did that on purpose so that there'd be a bit of variety in the presentation styles, to give you the opportunity to
put your comments saying, well, I like that bit, or I'm not quite so keen on that bit, or whatever. So don't forget, you can put your comments down below if you want to, and let me know that sort of thing, or anything else that you're interested in. So that was the first Chocks Hangar. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching it. I know it was a long one, but hopefully it was interesting. As I say, I intend to have stuff coming thick and fast, which means that there will be another Chocks Hangar video later this week, certainly only a few days away, and we're going from kind of ancient to modern. We looked at a Stearman, quite an old biplane, so next we're going to take a look at a really up to the minute modern airliner. We're going to check that out and learn a little bit about that. So and it's one that, you know, a lot of people aren't that familiar with it being so modern. So that should be pretty interesting, so look out for that one. Don't forget that you can hit the notifications on YouTube if you want to get a notification of when that video is available. You can subscribe if you want to, or you can just kind of check it out randomly and all that kind of thing. But whatever you do, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you'll enjoy the next one that's coming up. But for now, from Chocks Hangar, I'm going to say to you, bye. Keep it flying. Bye.